Welcome to the 2-Month Review. This is Chad Post from Open Letter Books. I'm here with Lytton Smith, who is a translator of Tómas Jónsson Bestseller by Gudberger Bergson, the book that we're talking about, have been talking about for the past few weeks, and we'll be talking about for a number of weeks to go as we work our way through it bit by bit, talking about things that interest us, ways to decipher this book, ideas that come out of it, any and everything related to the Icelandic Ulysses, so to speak. And this week we're joined by Jacob Rogers, who is a translator himself from Galician, and who is also a bookseller at Malaprop's bookstore in Asheville, North Carolina. So welcome, Jacob.
Hello.
So I asked you a few questions to get started. We could talk about your translation thing, but I'm more interested to hear about the bookstore. How did you end up working at Malaprop's?
I've lived in Asheville about 5 years now. I went to school here, so I graduated with my bachelor's about a year ago. It was sort of just a coincidence where about 2 years ago I started going to a Works in Translation book club that is started by one of the managers at Malaprop's, Justin. I would just go to that every month and just hang out, just sort of read books, and because I was starting to get interested in translation at the time, so it was just a nice outlet. And then, I keep leaving Asheville to go travel to Spain and Galicia. And then I didn't actually think I was going to come back to Asheville after I graduated, but I did about a year ago. And then basically just told him, he's a manager. I was like, if you guys ever have an opening, please let me know. They did have an opening about a year ago, in like September. And so I interviewed and then got a job. It wasn't like nepotism, but like a little bit.
That's how the book industry runs, I believe.
I know. I was like, I know that I'm good at my job in the end, so I don't feel bad about it. But I was like, yeah, no, because we get people coming into the store like every other day, like, hey, how do I get a job here? And I'm just like, come to the book club for 2 years, I guess.
That's kind of, that's really is what it should be, though, because you need to be familiar with like the books, the clientele, the sort of environment that's being like cultivated at the bookstore, all that kind of stuff. Yeah,
that's true. It's definitely helped for that because I spent a lot of time in the store. But, I just have to self-deprecate a little bit so that people know.
Fair enough. We had the first bookstore I worked at was Schuler Books and Music in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and that was back when you could still have a test where it would give you like 100 titles, you need to name the author, or like then 100 authors, you need to name a book by them, and that was like the easy way for like people could apply all the time. But if you didn't get like 80% on that, then like there's no possible way that you'd be able to work there. But if you couldn't pass that test, then like you weren't going to be able to identify the books that when people would come in pre-internet age, this was, and be like, I want whatever from some author, and you had to know that they were either wrong or right or who that was or what they were referring to. So it was like in that point in time, like that was really important. And since, I understand why people really don't like the test, that it's like biased in various ways, so on and so forth. But it was pretty convenient for that, for specifically like, how do I get a job here? Take this test, and then we'll either maybe call you or maybe not, and then it's all personality afterwards.
Yeah. Well, no, it is funny. This is like not the case 90% of the time, but occasionally someone will come in, say a book, and sometimes I know that we've had it and just need to check that we still have it. I'll type into the computer, and then sometimes, and this is like the 5 or 10%, I'll just sort of like stick my finger up in the air and say like, we have it, and then run, and then they're so surprised. But like, so it is nice to like have they can say an author, and I just go on LitHub every day, which is really the main thing. Just keep up.
We reserve our LitHub comments for the other podcast. All LitHub fans who are listening can go seek that out.
Doesn't the Strand supposedly still do that test?
I think so. Although, maybe they could get away with it. Like, it's easy to criticize in certain areas, but maybe not with the Strand.
Yeah, the article I read about it was sort of like, ooh, look at this cool, quaint thing the Strand does.
It was pretty widespread until it became clear that it was like pretty biased towards a particular set of authors, namely white males. But like, the big difference is you go into Barnes and Noble here in Rochester, and someone will be like, do you have, if it's anything that's not the Hunger Games, be like, do you have Old Man and the Sea? And they're like, I'm going to have to look that up. Do you know who the author is? And then they sit and type at the computer for a while, and there's no use. There's no value to that person. They're just a clerk. They're not like knowledgeable. And that's a huge difference from a number of years ago. But
having a literature degree helps.
Yeah, definitely. And just being around bookstores, because there's lots of books that you never hear about with a literature degree that exist in the world, and you just sort of know because they're in stores or you're in stores. How did you get into translating Galician and going to Spain all the time? What's your backstory there?
It's more coincidences. I grew up in Chapel Hill since I was about 7 in North Carolina. They had a mandatory Spanish there, and then through sheer inertia, I just kept doing Spanish pretty much through college. I'm not kidding. Like through high school, I was like, oh, I have to do a language. Might as well just keep doing Spanish, huh? But then I actually got interested in college and was doing Spanish as a major. And I don't actually remember if it was because of the Works in Translation book club or really why it started, but I started getting interested in translation. And my professor let me do some bad translations of some Cortázar stories for a project. I think this is an origin story for many translators of Spanish-based languages. And then at a pretty similar time, I was planning to go study in Spain for the summer. Took a class that involved me learning about some of the minority languages and some of the boundaries and stuff, and planned to go to Galicia just to sort of see it and learn a little bit more about the region. And then I found this website called the Portico of Galician Literature, and it's run by Jonathan Dunn, who you mentioned to me that you knew.
He's a great guy. Yeah.
But I just found this website and emailed him, was like, hey, this seems like there's this one guy translating a lot of the books. Like, do you have his contact info? And he's just like, oh, that's me. I was like, oh, well, this is easy. But I told him about my plans, and he told me about a class, a month-long course that you can take in Galician every summer in Santiago de Compostela, which is the capital of the region. So I ended up actually being able to morph my plans and not take my Spanish classes that I was going to take and just take that Galician class for a month. Basically just welcomed with open arms by everyone, including the other people on the course. So this past year, or last summer, I went back and did it again. And then it's just sort of been I just found books and literature that I really liked. So I've just sort of stuck with it. And it's really beautiful language. So it's really nice. The food's better than the rest of Spain. People are nicer.
Wow, you're throwing down a lot of shade there.
Gotta have some pride.
Yeah, right on. And I actually met you in person at Translation Loaf, or whatever they call it, Translation Bread Loaf, Translation.
We still call it Bread Loaf. Translation Loaf.
Translation Loaf is
Breadlation.
Translation Loaf is a good title, though. I like that.
Isn't it? It makes more sense. Translation Loaf, you cut off a little bit of translating.
But I think yours is better.
You eat a little translation, it feeds your soul. Actually, ironically, one of the person who's going to be a guest on this next week, Idra Novi, was also there this year as one of the instructors.
Oh, that's fun.
But do you want to say just a few? What's that?
She was my manuscript.
Right.
Leader, workshop, leader, blah, blah. So I can't remember the term.
Yeah, do you want to say anything about that for anyone who's listening and not familiar with it? Because it is, for anyone who's listening who's into translation and being a translator, this is a pretty amazing opportunity, I think.
Just about the conference in general?
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually found out about it from Susan Bernofsky's blog, Translationista, which also for anyone interested, if you don't know about that, it's a really good place that she just posts stuff like awards and other resources. So I found out about it through that. And then they have 2 workshops, I guess. One is introductory, where you don't have to have a super good knowledge of your language, and you don't really have to have a manuscript that you're working on. Mm-hmm. You get to meet and work with a translator, a distinguished translator, and just sort of feel things out and learn a little bit about the process. I think that's only one of the workshops, but then there's 4, I believe, or 3 that are dedicated to poetry, prose, or some kind of mix. And that's where you actually have to send in a manuscript of some kind. So I sent in 4 short stories by this author, Begonia Pass, that I worked on. And then I got placed into Idra Novi's workshop, which was a prose poetry mix. And we ended up actually having a couple plays as well. But we just, I mean, it was really cool. It was like a week of adult summer camp.
Yeah.
Like I guess it was in June, right?
Yeah.
Like the place is beautiful, and like you
it's in Middlebury, Vermont, just to make that clear in case anyone doesn't know. Yeah, it is gorgeous.
But yeah, you just spend the week, like, you don't workshop every day, but when you do workshop, it's for like 2.5 hours. And it's not like, that might sound grueling and boring, but like it was just really like engaged and fun. And I think that was partly because Idra is like a really good workshop leader. But I mean, you got all this time to look at other people's translations, which is somewhat more beneficial sometimes than just looking at your own, because it helps work through just general issues.
Right.
And then all these lectures by everyone involved. So not just your workshop leader, but the other distinguished translators are there giving lectures on their own work. So it was like definitely probably the most productive thing that's happened since I started being a translator. And anyone who didn't know about it before definitely should do it, or try, or just, it was amazing.
It's super cool. So I'm going to just jump in and say we should, so shout out to Idra, who is coming on next week. But I guess, like, as of air date, today is the last day in Women in Translation Month, and Idra is an amazing translator, but also a novelist with a great book about a woman whose novel is being translated and who disappears. So, kind of a nice set of tie-ins there if anyone wants to check out her work. Yeah, very true. Mm-hmm. Very true, and good shout out. So after we met, I sent you some books down to Malaprop. So one being Tómas Jónsson Bestseller, which you devoured, and emailed me about how you really liked it and wanted to come on the podcast. So what are your general thoughts about this?
Man, it's been a while since I read it. I just remember the first few chapters, wherever, I can't remember if they were long or not. It was just such a funny voice. Like, I really like curmudgeons, and he's like through and through a curmudgeon. It's just like, I don't know, I've always really liked reading stream of consciousness-y kind of books, and this one is just really good. It flows really well. He's really funny without knowing that he's being funny, which is the best kind of funny in a book. Just the whole it's a really one of my sort of favorite time periods to read about, just that sort of after World War II, but before you really get into postmodernism. Like Lee Spector too, weirdly enough, like just that like 50s, 60s, just like weird stuff was happening. Everyone's sort of still confused. And I felt like this was a good way to write a book in that time period that was like awesome. And just like I don't know, disjointed stuff is really fun to me, and it doesn't bog me down. So I really like reading it.
That's interesting to say that, because there is like I'm always attracted to periods in time in which things are in flux, or like there seems to be more possibilities, and especially right now I don't feel like there is for American literature. Like there probably, I mean there is, and it's mean to say that, but in comparison to other points in time, it feels a little bit more like the sort of traditional narrative, the neo-realistic narrative that's pumped through like the second tier of MFA schools, and sort of given you as a formula, which is something that Tómas Jónsson sort of plays with in here too. That's like really ascendant, and like everyone's reading those kind of books, writing those kind of books. All that's kind of like the way to go. That or now it's like the second rate, like auto fiction, like the Ben Lerner sort of stuff. But that's one of the things that attracts me to international literature overall, is that it feels still like things are in flux when we get these books that are from different time periods. But even now that there's more options, that people are trying different ways to create narrative. So it makes sense as why you'd like this particular book for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what attracts me to, like, Virginia Woolf is probably my favorite person from the modernist period. And it's to say, I think this is just another good example of like a text from a certain period that's a really good, solid exemplar of like what was going on somehow. I don't know. It's just such a weird, it's so particular, but you can draw a lot out of it. Like there's so meandering, but like if you just sort of let it flow, you sort of get more of it in a way.
Yeah, I agree. And so today, the one, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but we're going to be covering two of his sections, the 5th composition book and the 6th one, which is just Roman numeral 6, because none of these are consistent, as is Tómas Jónsson Bind. And if you've been listening to the podcast in the past, I always try and summarize things generally, which worked fairly well for the invented part, but for this book is a little bit more difficult. So I think rather than trying with like the 5th composition book to like say, here's sort of a grand overview of what's going on, it might make more sense to take it almost section by section or theme by theme. And the first thing that struck me about this section that comes up throughout the X number of pages, I don't know, the first half dozen pages, is how much it's about observing other people, which is a very Tómas Jónsson trope of like he's stuck in his bed. They keep going back to that scene of like his lodgers having sex in the hallway and the light being on and him watching them. But this one kind of gets there through like the idea of waking up and looking outside and watching other people wake up and watching them like get ready for their day. And it's all this kind of weird, strange watching thing. And then that sort of contrasted with the fact that like he doesn't like other people watching him, and he doesn't want them to see his like his belly buttons and outie, and people are going to make fun of it, like the anchor. What is he called? The angler, like
right?
This crazy thing. But he's got this big tension around this idea of like observing and watching other people, and being sort of almost on the outside or like beyond that. And that's a theme that comes up a lot in these two sections of being not quite part of the scene, but beyond the fringes, sort of watching it.
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea that what's coming across in this book is his curmudgeonly nature, because that's really reassuring and gratifying. But he is, he is in this role of just trying to observe the world around him. And he's really, part of the curmudgeonly thing is he's really judgmental about that world, right? And, and I think that one of the big things that happens in this section, for whether some of our listeners are sort of thinking back on it, or maybe even just about to start reading it and listening to the podcast before doing so, there's this whole long, italicized section where he's talking about this organization called the Board. And
that's in the 6th one. That one's huge.
Yeah, and basically, it's this organization which runs through the rest of the novel, and so it's really important to sort of think about, and was this really interesting thing for me to be translating, because basically, it's a dining hall or a refectory where all of these people are, eating together and talking together, and some of them are colleagues at work from the bank, but there's also other people who show up, and you've got these like foreign students who are there at one point, and it's this kind of like heady, intelligent conversation that often takes itself too seriously. And there's sort of a critique of the progressive liberal in here, which is really interesting to have at this moment in time in America, because, of course, the book's written in 1967 in Iceland. But then you've also got this sort of class division where, like, you've got the inner and the outer room, and the outer room is sort of mainly these blue-collar workers, and as the book goes on, you get to learn more about them and sort of the high fatality rate. And so you get the sense of this book as, it is a novel and it has this plot and it's a character study, but it's also this sort of social satire and social critique. And I think that's why observing is so important, because in some senses, I think the novel is saying there's a real danger when we're not observing.
There's, in these two sections too, in the 5th and 6th one, there's a couple of things that you just remind me of. One is that he says at some point in time, I can't remember if it's Olaf or is it Sigurdur? How do you say that?
Sigurdur.
How do you say it?
Sigurdur.
That's very fast. So Sigurdur, his one of the two of them mentions that all literature should be satire, or maybe they both do. Right. They both agree that all literature should be satire, which then that you're sort of pointing to, that this book as a novel as a whole is sort of like laying out the inner workings or the way that the society works, and at the same time sort of poking at it or prodding it or criticizing it. From this point of view of a curmudgeonly guy, but it does have that kind of satire line to it. And the other thing that reminded me was that the board sequence and like that section comes at the end of the 6th book. And the 5th one, which it seems to be like a lot about invasion. Everything's about invasion. So he's observing, but then people are always invading him. Like there's a bit about on 79 where he's like, trying to use the bathroom and everyone's trying to break in. He's like, this man deserves rewards for his age and his decency. Here you sit. This is you. No, I was not allowed to think like that for long. The door was grabbed from outside. The knob yanked twice. What? Is the door locked? Who's in there? Who's loitering on the toilet? You're like, It's just this disrespect that he gets throughout it. There's this kind of invasion sensibility. Whereas in that second part, when it finally hits, like you get Olaf, you get Sigurdur, you get some information about them and like where he's aligning with them. And then that board section really grounds these two parts in a way that I think we haven't had to this moment. Like there's been a lot of like different ways, different threads that you could sort of pick up about himself and about how he's describing his world and what's going on. But that board section just like brings it home. And is one of the most lucid sections that we've read so far, like extendedly lucid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny that you...
No, go on, Jacob.
No, I just thought it was funny that you mentioned invasion because there are occasional references throughout the book to something that I knew nothing about and was sort of confused by at first. But on page 96, it's just the end of this little parenthetical note at the top where he says the American military huts left over from the war. And I'm like, why was the American military in Iceland? And so I was looking into it, and they were I didn't know that they had been invaded during the Second World War by the Allied forces. So that, I think, even to add on top of it, is just this feeling like Iceland was being subjugated by other powers, and I think he's sort of he feels that way within his own home too, and I think that's a really interesting, like, national and then particular kind of distinction.
Hey, Lytton, do you want to take it away and explain the military base?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a fascinating moment in Icelandic history, and Iceland was sort of trying very hard to stay outside of World War II, for geographical reasons amongst anything else. I mean, sort of that, they're sort of quite out there and therefore not a part of it, even if, I think most people would sort of say that they were politically allied with the Allies, but just sort of keeping apart from it. And so there was this proposal by the US to actually, the proposal, I believe, was to build 5 military bases at one stage. And so this agreement that there would be a military base in Iceland is both sort of like a victory for Iceland, in that it was seen as the then Prime Minister having stood up to the US, but also then this defeat for Iceland, sort of this kind of invasion. And a lot of the novel is preoccupied by this sense of how American culture has then changed Iceland. At the same time, what the military base ended up bringing was, in addition to jobs and economic development, it sort of brought an infrastructure. And so you wouldn't have the major airport in Iceland that you have now that's sort of, making the tourism industry possible without having had the military base. And there's that sense of, therefore, Iceland has this really paradoxical relationship to the outside world. And the novel, I think, is really interested about this, what's outside and what's inside. You even get moments where, like, Anna Katrin, she's wearing, like, Tómas Jónsson is recording the clothes she wears when she's inside the house and how they're different when she's outside. And he's really interested in that division.
Yeah, which is really true. There's the other part that, I have a question for you. Did the military base is no longer active, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
When did it stop being active?
Only a few years back. Although there was bizarrely a proposal to sort of re-establish it fairly recently, under the sort of tail end of the last administration. But it, it's been, and it was sort of the US that pulled out, really. So, you had more, I think the Icelanders were sort of happy to have it deactivated, but it sort of came at the instigation of the US in 2006, if I remember rightly.
Oh, wow.
But that's led to sort of all kinds of questions about employment and and what you do with the rest of the facilities that are there.
And yeah, I can only imagine that's a huge, it's a big difference. But it is kind of interesting, like how the global structures have changed too, and the importance of having a base in Iceland is different now than it was back in 1944. Yeah. Or when is that when it started? 44 was in or just after World War II?
It was 40 or 41 when they invaded.
Okay,
right.
So yeah, right at the start of World War II. There's another in reference to invasion in this 5th book, in the 5th composition book, there's one of his crazy things that he writes, like his fairy tale type of thing, in which there's the king who has no heir, which seems like a very veiled stand-in for himself. And then Katrine, who is married to some guy who's like the lovely maiden or whatever, and he asked her if she'll like let him impregnate her so that he could have an heir, and she's telling her lover, like, we need to do this because then we can just take over the kingdom and just, then we'll have royal blood and we'll be able to like take everything over. So there's even that's another one of these connections between like the outside world, fairy tale world, and like his world all kind of coming together. Mm-hmm. What do you make of the Anna Katrine thing? Is it just that the two characters in his mind become essentially one and standing in for like woman lodger, or is there something else going on there?
Jacob, I mean, I'm curious of your thoughts, as a reader, and then I have some thoughts as the translator.
Yeah, I mean, what Chad just said, that's how I kept reading it. Just where it's like Anna Katrine, and then all of a sudden it's Anna Katrine, and he's just sort of, it's all the same to him. He just sort of merges them in his head, and then it's really more about him and women. And he's so preoccupied with like their sexuality all the time. And I mean, this little part was one of my favorites, where all of a sudden he like has this like really grandiose metaphor where his apartment is a kingdom, and the sovereign king was dying without having provided the state with an heir. So I mean, it's really, in a way, it sort of just goes back to any other sort of man-woman dichotomy, where it doesn't really matter who they are. He can just lump them into two, and it's more about just them being able to bear him an heir, I guess. So that's how I sort of saw it.
And one of the themes that like one way to read this novel is as a novel that's deeply concerned with like how housing works in Iceland. And so Tómas is kind of upset because he's in the basement, and in theory what's meant to happen is that as you go through life you rise up from a basement apartment to a ground floor, then first floor and second floor, and you see this all over Icelandic literature, right? So when somebody's just left school, they're always moving into basement apartments, and that's both practically true, but it's also symbolic of their status in life. But Tómas has got to the end of his career. He's been a professional person in a bank, and he's still ended up in the basement, and he's convinced, and there's sort of paranoia to this, he's convinced that his lodgers are trying to steal the apartment from him. And so that's also this other theme of I think, of Iceland. If you think about, like, Iceland is worried that somehow the US are trying to steal the country from them, that's also, playing bass to it all. But I want to digress to a quick funny story that's related to that's not in the book, but just people may be interested in this. But there was a proposal like about 100 years ago where this Icelandic guy came up with the idea that it was unsustainable to live in Iceland. And so he, I forget which US president he met with, but he met with one of the US presidents and basically over a bottle of whiskey convinced him that Iceland should be sold to the US and all the Icelanders repopulated in Alaska.
What?
And, right. And there's a whole sort of, I only heard this for the first time a year ago. And there's obviously a whole sort of huge problems with this. Alaska has plenty of people who would like that to be theirs. Thank you very much. But it is that sense that, like, maybe only in Iceland could you get both this like immense love of country. So, you love it enough to care to see what happens to it going forward, but also this extreme pessimism of like, well, there's no way we can possibly live here. So we have to do something radical like sell our entire country. But so if you've got that climate behind the book, you can understand some of the sort of like the uncertainty about where you live and where you might belong in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Man, that is.
It does feel like there's a current of like these conversations he has with his coworkers, or Sigurdur and Olaf, like their visions of the direction for the country. That's definitely like a preoccupation throughout.
Yeah, I want to talk about Sigurdur and Olaf. So they show up throughout, because correct me if I'm wrong, Lytton, but isn't Olaf the person who gets the promotion that Tómas Jónsson thought he was going to get? Yeah, so Olaf is like, so in some there's moments in time where Tómas sort of aligns himself with Olaf, since Olaf was successful. He sort of wants to like be like him, I guess, in a way, or like at least be on his side. And Sigurdur and Olaf are both bank employees. They are on the inner table of the refectory, right? Yep. The board. They're on the board, the innermost circle, and they endlessly seem to debate and argue With Sigurdur being both like, he's characterized at one point as being a complete drunk and trying to molest the porcelain ladies from the bookstore. Of course, I love that like the two ladies that are always part of the board are like these charming, attractive looking women who work at bookstores and stationery shops, which is kind of fantastic. And then so Sigurdur tries to sort of molest them, take them out, whatever. He's also drunk. He's recovering from a hangover. He's kind of a commie. He wants to like help the labor union, but in the most ham-handed, sort of heavy-fisted way. And then by contrast, Olaf is like an intellectual, but he's basically seems to be described mostly as just one of those intellectual skeptics who just like shits on everything, and therefore can't ever be criticized because he's just opposed to whatever. He has like nothing that he stands for. He just can rotate his arguments that you agree with him at all points in time, but like just by being circular, which is sort of a Tómas Jónsson thing too, where he kind of conveys that by like disliking basically everything. Although it's different, I think he's not just that sort of cynic. He's got something there that's kind of grounding him. But their bits are really fantastic in this section, and they're the ones who sort of lead us into the description of the board. Like they're introduced, they're sort of existent as characters. He has this like weird argument between them that Tómas feels like he needs to side with Olaf and make fun of Sigurdur and wants to like piss on him in the same way he's been pissed on before, I believe is the phrase. And then suddenly you get the board, and it becomes clear, like, Tómas is not part of the board. He's on the outside. But, like, and what the board is like all these, like, quasi-intellectuals that have been put themselves on top of everyone and sort of making judgments about society and about people. And Tómas is not part of that. And at the same time, they're just kind of blowhards for the most part. At least, maybe that's going a little far. But they are kind of like, they're always just talking and saying all these things, but they don't really seem to go towards any ending purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think they are blowhards. I mean, I think, Olaf's problem is precisely that, he's concerned to debate rather than concerned with what he believes.
Right.
And Tómas definitely has convictions. They might be completely fucked up convictions, but they are convictions, right? And Sigurdur is this sort of this extreme. I mean, he has this slogan of mezcal and Marxism, right? Which sort of just sums it up. And he's not, there's no finesse there to it or anything. The other thing to notice about this board thing, it's sort of hierarchies and everything. It's like, Tómas is sitting, for most of the book at least, is sitting in the inner room at the upper table, but like, you've got like that table seems to be divided, so the people who are right near the head are the people who are really the board, right? And then everybody else is kind of a hanger on. And it's really interesting to think about Tómas is kind of deliberately exiling himself from debates and conversations. And he even says this really interesting and beautiful moment where he produces a list of in this section of things I am in quarantine from, and it's sort of this self-imposed quarantine. And of course, the first one on that list is Sigurdur, and by the time you get to the end of the list, several pages left, it's Olaf. But imagine like that again, both as true of him as a character, that, he's a character who can imagine quarantining himself, and that Iceland is kind of doing that in relation to the world.
Right. And it is like it's that double facing sort of thing. Like he wants to be sort of affiliated with that inner circle and the board, but like on the edge of it, because being part of it is never any good. You want to be able to like criticize it or see it for what it is, but then he's not part of like the outer circle where it's all the day laborers and the workers who are like, drowning because the cement falls on them, and that's a good way to die. And like the fact that like all they do is like like muck around and shit and pig vomit and then like sleep in their clothes and come in to get their food the next day.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful. And then you have Sigurdur going over them and be like, you need to live a better life. Like, you need to get a trade union. And they're just like, fuck you, buddy. Like, quit telling us what to do. This is what Helder Laxness intended for us.
Right.
And this is one of the sections that Laxness shows up a lot.
Yeah, this is an ignorant question. I know that he's like the big Icelandic author, and Tómas spends a lot of this book making fun of him or criticizing him, but I'm just curious what his stand or where he stands just in Icelandic literature in general. Sort of, does he occupy that pride of place is like up at the top, and he's like sort of godlike in literature for them, or?
Yeah, I mean, he's the only Icelandic writer to have won the Nobel Prize in Literature, and it technically means that Iceland has won more Nobel Literature Prizes per capita than any other country in the world. He's absolutely seen as the great Icelandic writer, and Bergson himself, especially at this period, is skeptical about that. And he's not against Laxness, but he is wary of some of the elements of sort of what he seems to see as sort of a romanticization. It gets pretty. There's sort of some split hairs because they're both sort of espousing a sort of socialism, and they're both critical of sort of spiritualism and to some extent religion. So there's a lot that they have in common. But what it seems to come down to is Laxness ends up sort of fetishizing the individual character. And so in one sense, Tómas Jónsson is this response to Laxness, which says, I'll show you individual character. This is an individual character. Do we really want this? And it's true of almost everybody in the book. Everybody is this very, very isolated individual character. And, you don't want to spend much time with hardly any of them.
Mm-hmm. It's very true. And at the time the book is set, like, Laxness has written his three of his biggest books, Independent People, World Light, or I guess that's how it's translated, and then Iceland's Bell, I mean.
Iceland's Bell,
yeah, and then that's through 46, and then the Atom Station, which I think you translated differently, which I'm not sure what the title is. Yeah, did you do it as Atomic Station?
I mean, it could be. I mean, it's normally translated as the Atom Station.
Okay.
I mean, as I would imagine the Atom, but maybe it is actually. It's maybe it's slightly different in the. I have to check back at my notes.
Yeah, I can't remember. For some reason, and I'm not certain that this is. Okay, so if it is the Atom Station, it probably is. But anyways, that one came out in 48. But like over that course of time, leading up to like Under the Glacier, which comes out in 68, which is just after Tómas Jónsson Bestseller is released. Laxness sort of evolves, no? Like he goes from being like that kind of like the sort of socialist belief of like the individual person, the society as a whole is more valuable than like these capitalist merchant sort of way of taking advantage of people, and that the kind of rural life is positive. There's problems with it, but it's like good people trying to do their best and all that kind of stuff. And that evolves in a more satirical sort of critical look at society too over the course of his writing, correct? I mean,
I think there is a sort of an evolution in what happens, with Laxness, and maybe some of what could be said is that Bergson is cautious about the kind of reception that Laxness gets more than actually the individual novels themselves in a strange way, although. The Tómas Jónsson Bestseller isn't entirely anti-Laxness, right, although he's getting a bit of a dressing down here. But it's interesting to note that dressing down comes partly from in relation to sort of the Swede and the German at the table, who are these students of the Icelandic language, and so there's this sense of Iceland. I think what's going on here is not that like Iceland. Doesn't allow people to talk to them, or shouldn't allow them to talk to them about their own culture, but the way that Icelanders talk about Iceland and the way that visitors talk about Iceland, it's almost like they're two different countries, and you sort of need to acknowledge that fact.
Right. That's very true too, and that is pretty funny because they're always like, oh, this is what Iceland's like, and this is what's going to happen, and they're like, no, fuck off, Swedish dude. Right. Like you're not right. You're talking in a language none of us care about. You're giving yourself fake like Icelandic names and screwing it up all the time. Like you fetishize our culture to a degree, which is still something I think that probably, that could play out today in terms of like the tourist industry of like the sort of love of Iceland and sort of way that it could be sort of fetishized.
Absolutely. I think that one of the, one of the questions is really the moment at which you end up with sort of too many visitors to Iceland, and obviously the tourist industry is sort of funding the Icelandic economy, and Icelanders are generally really receptive to people coming and showing an interest in their country. And there's a kind of slight disbelief where people are like, you care about this tiny island with all the, this small number of people. But at the same time, there's just not the infrastructure to cope with the number of visitors. And so, you can't move for tourist buses and like most of the national sites you go to, and this is sort of a very Tómas Jónsson thing, but most of the sort of the sites you go to, there's barely even toilets there. Right. So quite literally, you've got all of these people coming to Iceland and literally shitting around the landscape. And Iceland is just like, well, wait a minute, what's going on here?
It's a perfect image. Perfect Tómas Jónsson image. The last part, sort of getting up there too. The last thing I wanted to bring up was in the sixth book, in the sixth section, which I quasi subtitled "How to Write for the People," because that's one of the lines towards the end, is the section where he both goes through and tries out a number of different writings that he creates, like sort of making fun of the types of writing that exist in the world, and has a ton of comments on books, ranging from on page 93 where he says, another one of my favorite lines, I have the strongest hatred for poetry, to the next page being it goes on, blah, blah, blah. No, they can write overstuffed books. I will not read them. Books that are made like the motion of the waves, rising and falling as chapters transition. And then it sort of parodies that, and it's very funny and talks about the journey, so on and so forth. And then there's maybe the best lines, which comes on 97, which is a very invented part sort of vibe to it, where he says, in truth, fiction is a superstition spun in the fabric of people who neither know nor want to know life itself. Life is not in books. If the writers and poets wrote about men at work and during their leisure, fiction would be superfluous. Should a writer, however, construct some narrative that does not exist in reality, but rather takes reality's place, i.e. the only true fiction, fantasy and imagination, then no one can understand it but the writer himself, supposing he even understands it. With this eliminated, nothing should be left but writing biographies. Fictions are useless to every living human. On the path of life, people meet others who are much closer to their problems and to real environments than those in novels. The only way to enjoy to the full. So he's these strong words against writing and all, writing in general, but all leading to the only thing you do is write a biography, which he's also shat on before too, with the ghostwriters and all the biographies are of lumpfish kings or whatever. But I think that's an interesting bit too, especially that it comes right before the long bit about the board, which does feel like the most coherent written part of his narrative so far. It's extended. It has the same beats. It all goes on there, and it begins too with all the stuff against writers. Writers are not physicians, but the carriers of infection who weep from their various individual sores and bestow those same sores upon the nation.
Go on, Jacob.
I don't know. I just find stuff like this sort of self-contradictory kind of statements in books really interesting. He's basically criticizing the act of writing fiction in and of itself, but meanwhile, he's in the middle of writing a fiction. I never know what to do with that kind of thing, because it's at the same time as I want to listen to, oh yeah, I agree with you, but it's contradicting itself, because he's asking us to pay attention to what he's writing as it is right now. And not that Tómas Jónsson is someone that we should be listening to necessarily, but I don't know. It's how much do I want to actually see this as a real theory of what the purpose is of literature? I mean, in a way, he could argue that he's writing a biography, I guess, a fake one. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I'm being coherent at all right now, but
you are, and it allows us, I think, to we haven't talked on the podcast too much about the title of the book, right? And Tómas Jónsson bestseller, and this is lots of ways to take that, which is that he wants to be a person called Tómas Jónsson who is a bestseller, right? Or is it that the person will be the bestseller rather than the book being the bestseller? Or and there's a lot of ways to sort of interpret that, and the ways that we sort of often confuse the person who wrote the book for the ideas within the book. And there's a relationship, but they're not the same thing by any means.
Right.
There's a really good example of what you're describing, Jacob, is Myślewski is this Polish author. This book, Stone Upon Stone, which won the Best Translated Book Award a few years ago, is all like told from the voice of a farmer, and it's very lyrical in a kind of farmer sort of way, and very simplistic. Like there's no em dashes, there's no semicolons. It's all told like a voice that's talking, but it's very intricately constructed and tells of like the modernization of this one particular part of Poland and like his life throughout those times. And there's a whole long sequence in which he's like gets injured. Because I think he gets hit by a car trying to cross this road, because once all of a sudden there's a road, there's no way for him to get from one side of the field to the other because it's an endless string of cars that are just racing by. And it's very funny and overblown. And he's trying to cross, he gets hit. He's in the hospital, and people start bringing him books, and he goes on this like long 4-page rant about how books are stupid, reading is stupid, literature's stupid, doesn't add anything. What you should be doing is tilling the soil, all that kind of stuff within the context of that book and that voice. And there's some way that's like asking you to sort of reconcile those things, but at the same time, the character isn't. I sort of suspend your disbelief in that he's not writing this. This is just somehow an imaginary record of his thoughts.
Right.
And in this case, like we've got Tómas Jónsson sort of writing these things, but he's just writing in a notebook the way that like if you're old and alone and need someone to talk to, he's just writing these crazy ass composition books that never feel like they cohere, or he's like kind of maybe trying to start and stop them and make them cohere, but at the same time knowing that he's not writing a coherent book that like Olaf and Sigurdur are going to be talking about and debating at the board as being one of these great works of literature like Helder Laxness, is sort of like, fuck this then. fuck your literature. Fuck writers. Like this is bullshit. This isn't life. Life is me lying here knowing that I'm going to die with Anna Katrine out there like slutting around and like and like Gerda at the place being the pure pinnacle of virginity, and like fuck all of this, and writing sucks.
And, and the funny thing is, you've got the layer to that is like, so on page 116, like there's this one of my favorite lines from the section. If any commie had written this story now, he would have made the ship a symbol for society and had the surf rinse it away in the night. And that's a massive spoiler alert for the end of the book, right? And like he literally says at this moment on page 116, the end, right? And readers will see how that plays out. And so you're sort of reading this as a reader and as a translator and thinking, this book is so carefully stitched together. And yet it's all about things not cohering and falling apart, and maybe there's no point in even reading it to begin with.
Amazing. Really amazing. So to wrap up, do you have a favorite line from this section, Jacob, or do you need me to buy you some time?
I mean, this is a bit self-interested, but I really enjoyed the random parts in book 5 where it's in italics, 85 and 86, where he just starts writing in Portuguese.
Yeah.
For the obvious reason that I know a little bit of Portuguese, and so I was just curious, Lytton. These translations, I mean, I'm sure he did them in Icelandic too, but they're obviously not at all accurate. But I mean, so did you just take them from how he translated them, or I mean, they're like, I don't know, they're like half accurate, like
right? Yeah. I mean, it's one of those impossible things. I mean, where I'm sort of like looking, trying. I mean, I haven't got the ancient Portuguese, and I wish I'd known you back then because I could have, run some things by you. But it's a really weird moment where you actually have like these moments, and then you have them translated, and he translates into Icelandic, so I'm translating his Icelandic, but I'm also trying to look at the ancient Portuguese. And then you've got this weird footnote which says these translations by Tómas Jónsson from the ancient Portuguese are largely absurd, but they are accurate, well, not so much, and read well. But then they should really be worse, right? In the sense that, like, how on earth has he even got this close? But then that footnote is then annotated TJ. And it's like, wait a minute, is this Tómas Jónsson footnoting his own footnote? Is it another TJ who's not Tómas Jónsson? And it's these level of mysteries. And we should say that there is a moment on page 87 in this section where, like, we actually get a narrator who's definitely not Tómas Jónsson at the end of book 5, who seems to be the person who's actually compiled all of these notebooks. But it's a very rare moment. Like, that figure comes in right at the end. And it's really rare that on page 87 to 88, you've got that voice.
I meant to ask you about that because that jumped out at me because of all the I's that show up that aren't footnoted. Because last time I showed up, it was footnoted as being like "ha" or something like that. It was like a joke. And then this one, like you've got like him talking about Thomas in the third person, and it feels pretty accurate. As if someone had observed this and observed like how Thomas reacts to like the people, his lodgers, and what happens when they try and like half tease him and his face is all fucked up. But then at the end, like all the first day in the refectory, I was quite surprised to see old Tómas Jónsson there sitting next to me at the table, partially pitied the man, and it starts to have that like over sympathy that makes it feel like it's back in Thomas writing this about himself because he's always got that like, oh, there's been injustice done towards me.
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah. No, that's it. Oh, sorry.
Go on.
Well, I just wanted to clarify that I thought your translations of the translations were good. They are like reading the Portuguese, I can see that they're just like inaccurate, but like I like the way they read it. It's really strange. Like they sort of turn out well in English. So I completely agree with his footnote.
That's awesome. That makes me really happy that things like come full circle. And that's also the fun thing about this podcast, right? Having different voices on each week is like, like this is a book that you almost need to read by committee. Like you almost need the board to read it. And so that's what this podcast is kind of doing.
Yeah. I mean, do you have a favorite line from this section, Lytton?
Yeah, on page 74, I think just it sums up, it makes you feel sorry for Tómas Jónsson. He says, obviously I was not man enough to openly oppose disgrace even in the confines of my own home. And he's just so pitiful and wretched there. And he has this sense of like, what is the right thing to do and what is not the right thing to do. And I think any of us who've ever had like overly loud roommates and, like not sort of stood up to them and been like, this is kind of annoying. You can kind of identify with that, even though he's this absurd and particular and curmudgeonly character.
Yeah, I marked that one. I had that underlined too. The one that I could pick any number of them, but I'm going to stick with the hating writers ones. And on 108, I do not read novels. They're written with secret revenge in mind. The revenge of craven writers who shrink from coming clean and spitting filth and obscenities in the faces of people on the street. Love it. I love it. So anyways, well, thank you so much for coming on, Jacob. Everyone that's anywhere near North Carolina should visit Malaprops because it's a fantastic store. And is there anywhere, are you on Twitter or anything that you want to plug?
On Malaprops or me?
You, personally.
Me? I'm on Instagram. I sort of stay away from Twitter.
Probably for the best. What's your, if you want people to follow you on Instagram, you can give us your username or whatever.
Are you ready? Mm-hmm. It's a little weird. It's BILBY OGRAPHY.
ORGA. What was the last part?
PHY.
What does that mean?
It's like bibliography, but changed to.
Yeah, I can't explain it. It's a long story. That would be going too far into the depths of my psyche, I think.
We need a spin-off podcast, which,
it would just be like every week, like 10 minutes of someone explaining how they came up with their particular handle.
Right.
That would probably actually be a good podcast.
People would probably like that. It's probably true. But okay, so you can follow. I'll link to it on the podcast as always. You can find us.
There's nothing interesting there.
Yeah, well, it's Instagram and Twitter. There's really like if you took all of Instagram and Twitter and compressed it into like one little what's the interesting part that's there? It's like probably like a little dot. I'll know this, but regardless, anyways, you can find us at Open Letter, and I'm at Chad W Post and. Lytton, you have a middle initial in your name, right?
Yeah, I'm at Lytton J. Smith on Twitter.
It is J. Smith. Okay. And as always, next week we'll be back with Idra, and we'll be going over the next two sections, which are Thomas's 7th composition book, and then I think the next one is just the number 8, correct? And that goes from page 140 to 199. So another chunk, but not too bad. And until then, I'll talk to you guys later.